Hello, I'm Sarah O. Lamb, Senior Fellow of the Technology Policy Institute. Today, our panel is the fifth of 6 webinars in the TPI Winter Spectrum Series. We have joining us today Shawn Bone, Senior Director of Public Policy at Verizon, Harold Feld, Vice President of Public Knowledge, Blair Levin, Policy Advisor at New Street Research, David Rettel, Founder and CEO of Saltpoint Strategies, and Arpan Sura, Senior Counsel of Spectrum and Technology at the FCC Chairman's Office. In the Spectrum series so far, we have discussed topics such as the economics of spectrum valuation, access models, and federal spectrum management. This week, we'll get more into the 2025 spectrum agenda. So we'll soon have a fully staffed OSTP and NTIA. There's a new Spectrum Pipeline Act of 2025 introduced last month in the House. Senator Cruz and Senator Fisher have held hearings and have talked about legislative activity from the Senate side. We also have National Spectrum Strategy implementation and Spectrum Auction reauthorization. So my first question for our panel is, what do you see as the most important spectrum policy agenda items for 2025? And we can do a quick lightning round to hear from everyone on this opening question. And Harold volunteered to go first. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'm going to say FCC spectrum auction reauthorization because that captures so many other things. It captures national spectrum strategy. It captures whether we're going to have more auctions or not. But the biggest issue is how are we going to negotiate a peace between the armed services committees and the commerce committees? It may be that they just roll over as part of the reconciliation, but I think that the military has a lot of powerful allies, and unless there is some way to resolve this conflict, whether it's through the national spectrum strategy or some other mechanism, I think we're going to be stuck.
David or Shawn, you want to go next?
I'll jump in, sure. I think actually, although it seems like taking it to another level of abstraction, I think it's actually just as important in terms of being all-encompassing of the issues that are most present in spectrum policy, and that's WRC 27 prep. It may seem crazy to begin doing prep for a hearing, or excuse me, for a conference in 2027, here in early 2025, but that's how this cycle works. And the sooner we can get US national positions in place, the sooner we can work the international system to make sure that we don't find ourselves trying to set policy, but being behind the curve. So I think getting the institutions that ordinarily have this sort of process on lockdown moving in the right direction again, that'll be the most important thing in the coming days.
Yeah, and I'll jump in, Sarah. I mean, I largely agree with what Harold and David have laid out. I think what we're paying attention to, obviously, what's going on the Hill with auction authority, as well as the discussion about whether there can be a pipeline associated with that. I would say, I think we're looking at the national spectrum strategy a little differently maybe than Harold is. I think we're interested to see what this administration does with the national spectrum strategy. I'm not sure that's going to be answered by Congress necessarily. There's a lot of work, and I think David's right. The personnel that are coming into the White House, to the State Department, NTIA, Department of Commerce are important. The other thing is, look, we're pleased to see Chairman Carr launch quickly into work on spectrum, launch the AWS-3 auction item, the NOI on extended C-band, very interesting to us, and we'll see how those play out, as well as the ongoing conversation on the future of CBRS and power levels and other modifications there.
You, Arpan, do you want to, or Blair? Yeah.
Arpan, why don't you go next? I'll go last.
Thanks, Sarah. I think Shawn picked up on a point that I wanted to spin out a little bit. We're still building the team in the executive branch when it comes to spectrum, and as you know, auction authority or not, there's a lot of important work that has already begun and needs to be completed. In a very short amount of time, the band studies that were keyed up under the former administration's national spectrum strategy, I think There's a general mandate and a desire to move faster, to have concrete targets, and that's whether on the executive branch side or the legislative side. Think, higher level of political interest. And so, as the team is forming and as there's a reset, between the agencies and new conversations that are ongoing, I think, that's an area that I'm paying attention to. That's an area that the FCC, where we want to be a positive and constructive ally to get more spectrum into the marketplace.
So while I agree with a lot of what's been said, I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective, which reflects my work on Wall Street. The biggest issue is one that people in DC never talk about, which is what does Dish do with its spectrum in the spring of 2026? The reason why I choose that date is that's kind of what Dish is signaling, like they're, shall we say, double down in terms of building out their networks, or just saying it's not going to work and selling off their spectrum. My firm values that spectrum about $62 billion. If it's sold off, then that then affects a bunch of other. And part of the reason for doing it too is that for Ergen to sell at that point is that if you look at the potential large auctions that the government might be running, they will come after that. If you're Ergen, you want to be before that. So that's an issue which, as far as I can tell, people in DC don't seem to care about, but Wall Street does. And the second thing is the spectrum battles on a number of individual fronts between SpaceX / Starlink / Musk and the wireless folks. You see this particularly in the C-band, but you saw it with the decision Friday to allow higher power limits in ways which AT&T and Verizon opposed because it will increase the out-of-band emissions. But Carr, obviously very proud of it, talking about increasing power levels, which I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying there are consequences. And as usual in Washington, we always talk about the upside, but not the downside.
Great. Well, thank you for that lightning round. So I thought as an organizing principle, we could go through maybe each institution one by one and talk about, what our recommendations or thoughts would be for the incoming leadership. So to start, I guess OSTP and the White House, they're going to have Michael Kratsios, but I don't think he's been voted on yet, or it's still, in process. NTIA will also have Ariel Roth, I think, but she hasn't had her hearing yet. Do you folks have thoughts? What would you recommend to the executive branch right now to focus on, especially given, national spectrum strategy and work coming?
Happy to start. I think we really need to be jumpstarting, and I'll go back to what I said earlier, the WRC process. The WRC process, we learned last time, is something that really needs to have leadership within the executive branch early and consistently. If we want to be able to get to the actual conference and present U.S. positions that have been worked over in our region, CTEL, and also that have been worked over with our allies in other parts of the world, so that we have positions that we can defend when we get to the WRC that ensure American technology continues to be at the forefront, and that America's decisions on spectrum policy are not summarily overwritten by other regimes. And so, the sooner we can have sort of leadership in place at a political level, at the State Department, at NTIA, and we have at the FCC, that are engaged in making things run the way they're supposed to run, which is a process where you have sort of this behind closed doors in the executive branch process to come to terms with the public input on what we should be doing on spectrum policy. And we have national positions set with that we then work around the world to shore up. I think we'll all be better off if we can get that done quickly and can have that process kicked off with the kind of political leadership that allows it to be sustained over the long term, because it's going to be a long slog between now and the actual conference.
Can I just, and this will sound a bit snarky, but David, I mean this quite sincerely. Who are our allies?
I mean, historically, CTEL are our allies. And that's our region. That's North and South America. And, North and South America, CTEL has always been a little bit contentious in that there are parts of this region that love to hate the United States, and there are parts of this region that love to love the United States. I think the traditional orthodoxy on which camp each country falls in may have been upended in the last couple of months. Nonetheless, CTEL as a voting bloc is pretty strong. When they find ways to agree with each other, they tend to lock arms and stick with each other through the conference. And so I continue to believe that CTEL is an important region for us to work with. We also continue to have a lot in common with our European allies. Put aside the sort of larger macro politics of what's happening between the continent and the United States, on spectrum policy, we continue to have an economic alignment with Europe. And so I continue to believe that they will be allies of ours going forward on spectrum policy as well.
I'm not going to, I am going to say, I think it's a question mark. I think if you look what's happening in the markets today with the new Canadian tariffs, I think if you look at, I mean, and this goes to this big question of, is the United States representing what you and I might think of as our spectrum interests? Or are we representing the interests of one company, to be quite candid? And certainly if you look at the exchange between Elon Musk and the Polish foreign minister, the notion that we have European allies, it's a big question mark to me. And I think we're in deep trouble in a number of different forums where the collateral damage of basically saying to our traditional allies, no, actually, we'd like to ally with Russia. There are consequences that are not, obviously, there are more important consequences in terms of lives in Ukraine, but there are consequences in these economic matters as well.
Well, I don't think you're wrong. I think I'm reticent to draw a conclusion of what the next 4 years will be like in the first 100 days.
So am I.
Look, if the trend continues, you very well could be right. But given that it's been sort of a tumultuous 2 months, and we're all sort of waiting to see what the new normal looks like in the Trump administration, part two, like I said, I'm a little reticent to say that, the traditional way we have worked on spectrum policy won't continue to be the way we work on spectrum policy.
I think Blair raises an interesting point, and maybe I would go at Blair's point a different way, which would be, it would be helpful for this administration to set out a vision on spectrum early, and not, if it's going to deviate from the national spectrum strategy, if it's going to have its own vision for what spectrum is, it would be good for them to lay it out sooner rather than later. Because I think, Blair's point, well taken. The larger dynamics are what they are, but if you want to have an effective international diplomacy on spectrum going into WRC 27 or anything like that, it helps to have a strong domestic vision in place first, so that you can drive that compromise inside the government and actually be working with the allies on at various times to sort of explain what your vision is. So that would be my recommendation to this group is, digest the national spectrum strategy. I think from a Verizon perspective, we think the studies need to continue, but there's a lot of other things in that. Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? Do you think the study should be reshaped in some way? Make those decisions quickly, sort of make them publicly, and then go on delivering that as it feeds in the WRC 27 process. The other thing is, I don't think we could ignore all of the bands that are on the table for WRC 27. And I would recommend that this administration look at all of the IMT bands and all of the conversations that are going to go on, because the stuff that's pertinent to Region 2, the CTEL region, there are other conversations that are going to happen in the other regions on bands like 4 gigahertz that are important to us, and we should be paying attention to and working with allies on.
Yeah. So if OSTP were actually interested in what I had to say, I would give a quick hit list like this. Number one, the national spectrum strategy, I would say go with it, particularly pay attention to the workforce development stuff. That came up a lot unexpectedly to the Biden team. It's something that pretty much everybody agrees we have to deal with, and I hope that does not get lost. Number two, understand that you have to have, and I keep coming back to this like a broken record, but the fact is DoD fights dirty, and it's not just about Joint Chiefs or anything like that. You have to actually have them in the tent, have a way to make sure that they're feeling heard and feeling like a part of the process, and not just trying to roll them. There's a big lack of trust right now, and they have a lot of friends on the Hill, and they can really put a stake in things if that's what they're determined to do. The final thing I would say is private networking. You know, this is a place where the United States is leading. It's a big opportunity. I think that if we wanted to look at not how do we harmonize with China, which I think is a bad idea. We should be thinking about where do we have an edge, and private networking, ORAN. I, of course, am a fan of CBRS, which I know is going to get a response from Shawn, but sort of generally, even in other spectrum bands, this is something that we're seeing a lot of innovation here in the United States, and we ought to be encouraging that, because the way we have stayed on top of the wireless world for as long as I can remember is by being innovative, including being innovative in our regulatory approach as well as being innovative in our technological approach.
And just we're talking about OSTP and WARC. Does the FCC? It seems like, I mean, the FCC is the first to have everyone in place and getting ahead of all this. Are there thoughts about WARC already, putting together a team, and what are you working on, Arpan?
So the chairman has outlined a couple of priorities when it comes to spectrum. We need to move faster. We need to have definable targets, both in terms of megahertz and time frame. We need to have more focus on result and less focus on process. And then there has to be alignment, between the political leaders and the staff, right? And we've found that the lack of interest among the political leaders over the past few years has been to the detriment of the spectrum policy. So we got to get those things right. The other thing that he's emphasized is that spectrum policy is both terrestrial and satellite. The nature of intermodal convergence and all of the sort of cliches about that are actually true. You see it with D2D, you're seeing it with fixed wireless, but we need to think about spectrum policy in the main more holistically, and we think about our markets more holistically. And I would sort of chafe at Blair's suggestion that spectrum policy in this FCC is geared towards one or even a few companies. We are firmly in all of the above administration. We believe in licensed, we believe in shared, we believe in unlicensed, and we believe in satellite. And our goal is to slot those use cases in where it makes sense. And we're not, we're going to look at every band from first principles and, decide what makes sense based on the facts before us.
Great. Yeah. Do you want to reply to that, or?
Well, I would just say, look, what I said is a question that is being raised on Wall Street. I mean, I am part of that. But I hope that is true. And, there's data points going in both directions, right? But I certainly agree that I was delighted to see Brendan move very quickly with the AWS-3. I was delighted to see the NOI on the upper C-band. But those ultimately, conservatives like to say government shouldn't put thumbs on the scales. We should let free markets rule. But the problem is, for these companies, the most significant input is spectrum. And whatever decision the government makes does put a thumb on the scale. And so it is a question mark. But I'm not answering that question. I'm simply raising it to demonstrate that part of the issues as we look out on the next 4 years. But I'm delighted to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, no, just asking questions. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, Blair, you raised that that's what's being talked about on Wall Street, but it seems to me that on every single earnings call for the large carriers, they say they don't need spectrum.
Oh, yeah, this is one of the great ironies of the difference between DC and Wall Street, which I've been basically serving as a translator for most of the last 25 years. And in DC, and I look forward to what Shawn has to say, the argument from CTIA is we need spectrum, we need it soon, we need a lot of it. By by the way, as soon as they get it, they'll say, but not this year, because it's very expensive. Wall Street's view of a lot of what CTIA is saying is if 5G didn't really work out that well for the companies. They spent a lot of money on CapEx, but there was no new revenue source. And so when the companies say, if we don't get new spectrum by the end of the decade, service will degrade, Wall Street's reaction is more like, and therefore what? Like, are people going to turn off their cell phones because the service is a little bit worse? No. On the other hand, if you have to pay another couple $100 billion for spectrum to go into 6G spectrum and networks and all the things like that, where is the new revenue that will get a return on investment? So there is a kind of a disconnect between the discussions that I hear in DC and the discussions that I hear on Wall Street.
And I think, and I think maybe that's partially the Wall Street view on that. I think is partially revenues versus customer service. I mean, what I hear from our network folks is, we have certain customer expectations and reliability expectations that we want to meet. And if we don't have a sightline to additional spectrum, then, it becomes harder and harder to engineer the network to do what it needs to do to meet the capacity demands and things like that. I mean, we're watching on a year-over-year basis, we add 20 to 30% of traffic. Over the last 5 years, we're up 29%, and that doesn't incorporate what FWA is doing on the network. So it is a bit of a back and forth on what audience you're talking to. But to David's point, I will say the conversation on a pipeline has always been about a 3 to 5 to 10 year window. When we talk about to policymakers the demand for more spectrum, we're not talking about, tomorrow we need more input to the network. I'm not going to contradict my own CEO when he says, that deployment of C-band is ongoing and it's helping deepen, the capacity that we serve. But what we need is a sightline to the next to meet those capacity constraints and things that we're seeing, because if we can't meet that, then we do have a consumer reaction at some point.
Although I will point out that part of that is the repurposing of spectrum as it gets shut off. I mean, we went through, a couple of years ago, we went through the transition and the final shut off, and I expect we will eventually, have another set of transition where we'll shut off older networks and repurpose that spectrum for newer. So there is kind of a recycling that goes on in that regard that is part of that timeline that needs to be thought about. But I got to say, this is the problem for everybody. Everybody needs bigger channel sizes for bigger throughput. That's true for the folks who are dependent on unlicensed and Wi-Fi 7. That's true for the satellite guys who want to be able to have greater throughput. And ultimately, it is true for the licensed guys as well. And the real challenge for the FCC here is how to get an all of the above approach, as Arpan was saying, and being cognizant of new technologies. I mean, 10 years ago, satellite, the LEOs were the innovative ones, and it was important to make sure that they had, appropriate spectrum access. Now, again, I think the private network guys are where a lot of the hot action is. Particularly with ORAN and money that's coming into research through the CHIPS Act. What it'll be going forward, we'll have to see. But that's always part of the challenge is how you satisfy the growing need of everybody who's already in the game and leave room for greater innovation.
Right. I mean, that's a great question, Harold. And I think that the answer is, spectrum policy is not just about adding more megahertz, right? You can get more orange juice by putting more oranges in the machine, but you can also get more orange juice by squeezing harder. And then in this context, it'd be, moves to enhance spectral efficiency by revisiting some of our technical rules. And, there's a lot of good government stuff where we still have opportunities to, make more intensive use of the spectrum. That policy statement a couple of years ago, I think, articulated that framework very well. And, so even in the absence of auction authority, even in the absence of more orange juice, you can still get more orange juice But it's going to become hard, and it's going to require creative engineering, but we have a great team here, and I'm confident that we're going to be able to get some wins on that front.
Well, I'm very glad to hear you mention the policy statement because I was very happy when I saw that. I think that it's an important part of the process for everybody to recognize that at this point, it's all got to be collaborative. We've got to be working together to, not just put it all on the transmitters, but, improve the receiver side of the equation as well. And it was disappointing not to see the Rosenworcel FCC do more with that once they had issued the policy statement. So I'm certainly hopeful that we will see more action on that from this FCC.
Well, moving on to Congress. So, just what are your thoughts about how to get through any spectrum bills? There's reconciliation, there's reauthorization, pipeline. Do you think this Congress will make more progress? And even Senator Cruz and Fisher, they aren't in agreement either. Senator Fisher, is very protective of Department of Defense spectrum, and Senator Cruz is looking for more auction spectrum. So how do you see activity on the Hill happening?
I think Congress will do something for the worst reason, money. That is to say, I suspect that in the reconciliation bill, there'll be some auction authority that is pegged to some Congressional Budget Office estimate, which once it happens is entirely irrelevant. That is to say, if they say, we think the FCC will get 70 billion in the next 5 years, nobody goes to jail if the FCC raises zero. And I hope that's comforting to my friends at the FCC. Look, the original auction authority said the auction design should not be designed to maximize revenues. And that's absolutely right. And the political reality is when I was at the FCC, I got phone calls all the time from people. Can you find something that can give us an extra 3 billion? Because we kind of need, but I do think that something will happen. What Congress is not good at doing is all the necessary details and the engineering and the collaboration and broad grants of authority. I don't think, though David knows a lot more about this than I, they will end up identifying specific bands for the FCC to auction, rather simply saying somewhere between 2 and 6 or something like that. So the hard work will remain with the administration and the FCC and NTIA. But still, Congress giving back actual auction authority to the FCC would be a good thing, and hopefully they'll at least do that, even if for the wrong reason.
Yeah, I think Blair's right, and I think, or at least our industry is hopeful that they do something. I always thought it was ironic that there was that statement in 309J, Blair, when everything that's been done on auctions, including the original implementation of auctions, has always been done in a budgetary or spending context. It's always just seemed very funny to me. Look, I think what you're seeing right now is a lot of statements out of Representative Guthrie, Senator Cruz, and others about the desire to have spectrum right along on a reconciliation bill, largely because you can do it with fewer votes in the Senate. But I don't think that's going to relieve them of the obligation to talk to their fellow colleagues about, Fisher and others about sort of the equities there. My guess is Blair's right that an eventual compromise or whatever is included in reconciliation looks a lot like what Cruz, frankly, put on the table with his Spectrum Pipeline Act last year and Rick Allen did this year. And we're thankful that both of them have sort of brought forward the idea of having some commitment to auctioning a specific amount of spectrum, as well as identifying, unlicensed and potentially shared, doing that in a broad enough way with sort of targets of amounts of megahertz that it gives the flexibility to the administration to figure out the right bands to do it, but sort of making that commitment to, look, we're going to give auction authority back and actually do something with it, which is frankly something David and I worked on many times together in various ways in the past. And in my personal perspective is that's the best way Congress works, is to sort of get auction authority, set the broad parameters of where you're going to go with it, and then let the agencies and let the administration execute on it.
Largely agree with everything that's been said so far, and Shawn's right. I think we spent entirely too much time, Shawn, in conference calls with CBO trying to figure out the best way to get an extra billion here or an extra billion there out of a spectrum bill. I will say this, number one, I don't, I agree with Shawn that it should be a more general grant. Specific grants and specific bands, I know Blair decries that this is a pay for in Congress, but that's how things get done. And naming specific bands, generally speaking, lowers your score. Shawn and I worked on a couple bills over the years that have name specific bands, but as I like to remind people, those are usually bands that there had been a decade of work on before they got to Congress, and was pretty well aligned that, like, okay, this is doable, and we could go with a straight face to the CBO and say, hey, listen, this band's been worked on. I think of AWS-3 as sort of the prototypical example. AWS-3, I started working on straight out of law school, not even out of law school, I was still in law school as an intern in 2005. It didn't go into a statute until 2012. So, it's not something that can be forced. It's got to be something that sort of has organically grown up if there's a way to do it. And the second problem we face is that there just aren't candidates that fit that bill anymore. To Arpan's point, we have been squeezing and squeezing and squeezing. We've been squeezing more use out of the electromagnetic spectrum. But the reality is that the systems that are left in the bands that we haven't already gone after are expensive. And so if we're trying to run the traditional playbook, which is clear and auction, it's getting more expensive, which means net proceeds are lower. Gross proceeds might be very high, but net proceeds are going to be lower. And so, I think that's why you're seeing, and Shawn, I totally agree with you. I think that an approach that looks at licensed and unlicensed and shared is the way to go, because we have to adapt our spectrum policy to face the reality we have in use, which is that there are some systems that we can't move, at least not economically, and in some case, not physically, because the physics of that system require being in a specific band. And so putting all those options on the table, I think it's the only way we're going to be able to move forward. And, I'm appreciative that it seems like Chairman Carr is already moving down that path to making sure we're looking at all the options as we go forward.
Yeah, I would say, look, as an outside idealist, I would say stop screwing around with the policy. Just give the FCC the tools it needs, and let us focus on getting the best spectrum policy. As a realist, I understand the logic. But again, I come to sort of the same conclusion that David does of at this point, it's very hard to select specific bands. The worst result I can think of is that we continue on the path that we're on now, where the best you can do as a compromise between armed services and commerce is to say, well, okay, we know this band we can do, and we'll just go ahead with that. That would be the worst result. Just, give the FCC clean authority would be my recommendation. And the other thing I'd be curious to look at is dynamic scoring and clarifying the way in which CBO manages to come up with these scores. Dynamic scoring to try to recognize the value of unlicensed spectrum, which, while it does not generate auction revenue, provides a lot of value, and everybody agrees that it provides a great deal of value to industries and to the country as a whole. But at the same time, I do think that CBO is kind of a big black box for a lot of this. I mean, not on this alone, but it's just enormously difficult to follow, and having some sort of simplification, or at least kind of greater transparency into how the math works, would assist Congress in trying to calculate what the way to maximize the score, even if this is just sort of an artificial guessing game.
It's something we hear constantly, is the black box of CBO. David and I probably know a little bit more about the box than many others do, but I think Harold is raising a very, very important point about the transparency of scoring, the understanding, and frankly, you've got a renewed conversation in front of Senate Commerce tomorrow about increased transparency about just the overall value of federal spectrum bands and looking at, how do you think about that value over the long term and try to distill that down to a number or a concept. I do want to go back to something David said on the playbook. And it's within me to challenge David, as we've done for decades. But I think he sort of simplified in talking about the old playbook on clear and auction. I think he's simplifying the conversation that's going on in ways that aren't necessarily helpful. We've done a lot of work as the wireless industry since, even before AWS-3, about figuring out ways that you can coexist in bands with systems and still treat that band like a licensed full power band. And that's really where we are in a conversation. I know there's a lot of numbers thrown around sometimes by DoD and others saying, to lower 3, for example, if we were going to clear and license lower 3, it's going to cost us $200 billion. But that's not the conversation that's going on. I think we are much more open today to having conversations with agencies about channelizing bands, compressing bands, figuring out geographic sharing opportunities and things like that. And then, if once we do all of that work and figure out that that's not going to be sufficient to create additional access to a band, then you start looking at options like CBRS and others. So I think I just want to sort of challenge that the simplified view of where the licensed industry is, and say that, we're there to have the conversation with the agencies about the right ways to access these bands. We just want to do the work and see if we can get something like dedicated full power spectrum out of the bands before we opt for, some sort of sharing technology that's frankly limited in its application to our networks, but may be perfect for other applications like private networking or something like that.
Well, I will say that, if you're interested in experimenting with unlicensed underlays and seeing how you could, coexist with those, I think that would be an excellent way forward.
Just to go back to the CBO point a little bit more, just for the sake of education, does the CBO score, what's their methodology? Is it very different from, say, OMB's valuation metrics, or?
I'm pretty sure this is what they use.
And
I'm fairly certain this is what they use.
Is it the same team of people? Have they been there doing spectrum, or is it a new set of people just starting fresh every term?
God, I feel like the Carrot Top of this group on the prop comic that has something sitting on his desk, but it works. No, it's not it's a new person. So look, the analyst who had been there for forever that Shawn and I went roughly 7,000 rounds with draft text, recently retired in the last couple of years. And so we've had new analysts coming in, which has added to the uncertainty, right? When you lose the consistency of having the same analyst applying the same methodology, you get a new person. And because their process is very subjective, to be perfectly frank, it's unclear how things will shake out. Essentially, CBO looks at how much they think an auction could bring in, and then they start applying uncertainty metrics and discount your score based on uncertainty. And I mean, Shawn, you can chime in with your own stories. I know Shawn and I have been in meetings where we were told it doesn't matter what Congress says, X agency is going to do whatever they want anyway, and they'd give you an uncertainty score for that. They'd give us an uncertainty score every time, to bring things full circle. Every time a CTO or CEO on an earnings call would say, like, we're good with our spectrum position, they ding the score because they're like, I'm not sure they're not gonna invest as much money this time. Meanwhile, they almost always do, but they didn't give you that score. The bottom line for a CBO score, and I think it's important that everyone remember this, is that CBO scoring only matters until the bill is signed into law. And then it's completely irrelevant. It's not real dollars. It's fake dollars that CBO thinks may or may not come in, and for which there's no penalty, as Blair points out, if they don't. It's a tool for balancing out what we think is going to happen over a 10-year period as a result of policy changes. Whether it happens or not is sort of irrelevant once the bill is signed.
Yeah,
Can I just, it's somewhat in defense of CBO. I have been involved with pretty much every auction that's ever occurred, either when I was at the FCC or as a Wall Street analyst. Wall Street always does the same thing as CBO, right? They're saying, we think AT&T is going to bid this much and blah, blah, blah. and everybody is always wrong. And there's just 1,000 reasons for that. But one of them is the companies, and of course they should do this. If you want to get to 50, you have to argue for 100. You know, you're always going to complain, oh my God, if you do this, no one's going to bid. And then they show up and bid. And yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. And the CBO, my experience with them is they're acting in good faith. But part of my reason for mentioning the dish calculation is that as CBO is doing this, and they're thinking, okay, if we have an auction of the lower three, it'll be maybe in 27 and it'll raise so much money. Yeah, but what's your assumption about what Dish just did? Because if Dish sells their spectrum for, let's call it 60 billion, the amount of money that the companies are going to spend the next year in an auction inevitably is less, right? So, and who knows? One of the things that involves spectrum that we haven't talked about, and some people may be limited in what they can say about it, is the broadcaster petition for the new broadcast standard, which I would predict that the FCC will largely agree with. They won't agree with 100% of what the NAB asks. But if you look at that and you look at a likely change in the broadcast ownership rules, and you consider what Brendan has said about potentially doing another broadcast incentive auction, and I know low band isn't as popular now as mid band, but nonetheless, coverage spectrum is really good. You could see a number of broadcasters deciding doubling down or exiting, and that could cause a bunch of changes in spectrum too. And so, and I somehow doubt CBO was thinking about that when they were doing their calculations.
Yeah, I did want to ask about additional bands. So you mentioned the broadcast band. Do you think there is, other areas like white spaces, EBS, BRS? Is there other? They're not green fields, but are there other bands that could be coming up next?
Well, one should keep in mind that the ATS 3 is not about freeing up spectrum for auction. That's not what the broadcasters are looking to do. And frankly, wearing my consumer protection hat, there is a great deal of concern that if we go with some kind of mandatory ATSC 3.0 conversion and we're going to force people to buy a lot of new television sets and we don't have an auction to fund a converter box program, that there is going to be very severe consumer backlash. I mean, we especially with cord cutting, we have a lot more people who are dependent on over-the-air television, and the notion that we're going to tell people, sorry, you've got to buy a new TV set, and that's just not going to fly. But I would say, where you can find more spectrum depends on how and for whom. Starlink has put in a bunch of petitions for sharing of other satellite spectrum. Those are certainly worth looking at. I think, they may have some good points about their ability to share with the GEOs and with the MEOs, and especially if we're going to shrink the upper C band, we're going to want to provide some other places where they can make up that kind of that capacity. I think that tribal spectrum is important. I am very pleased that the chair included questions on tribal priority window, and that's a great way to get more spectrum out to people who both need it and who are demonstrating on a daily basis that they are using it and using it intensely. So, unlicensed, there are a lot of nooks and crannies we can explore. So, I think that you can't just say, well, where are we going to find more spectrum without asking the for whom and for what?
Yeah,
And
and oh, sorry, Blair.
I just very quickly, the broadcast petition is not about freeing up spectrum. It is about more intensive use of spectrum. And I think and then that affects the general market for spectrum. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
And actually, I'll put my broadcast hat on from many, many moons ago, even before the Hill. There is the possibility if you do ATSC 3.0, you can do multiple channels on a single what we used to think of as a single channel, the 8 megahertz, you can actually carry multiple channels on one now. So there could be compression options or whatnot, though I'm not advocating that. I do want to go back to, I mentioned it earlier in the context of WRC 27, but I think from the wireless industry perspective, a renewed conversation on 4 would be nice. It's something that the industry has identified for a long time, and we're talking 4.4 to 4.9 here, not the radio altimeter band. But look, the international community is looking at it for IMT possibilities in regions 1 and 3. That's going to come to a head at WRC 27. So I think, from our perspective, it behooves us to be thinking more about what that could mean from us from an international, competitiveness and harmonization situation. And the domestically, it was left out of the national spectrum strategy. There's an opportunity for this administration to bring it back in and take a look at it.
Okay, we have a few questions from the audience. We have Nick Lanneman from the Director of Spectrum X, the NSF Spectrum Innovation Center. He asks just a question about policy relevant R&D and spectrum workforce development. There's a national spectrum R&D plan. Do you all have thoughts on, what R&D priorities there should be?
Well, I'd love to see the R&D continue, particularly on sharing technologies. As Shawn pointed out, that's valuable to exclusive license to coexist with government. It's, of course, valuable for CBRS type sharing or unlicensed type sharing. It's a place where, as demand increases, we're just going to have to keep going. I hope that my great hope is that because spectrum research is very technical and boring, that it'll cause Doge people's eyes to glaze over and they'll just pass right by it.
Yeah, I mean, Harold sort of subtly pointed at it, but I think the beginning answer to Nick's question is, does the R&D plan even continue under this administration? I don't think we know yet, but I do want to double down on what Harold said, which is we argued in the development of the original R&D plan that doing work not only on sort of long-term new technologies from sharing, but improving compression, improving channelization, improving filters, and things like that, that could open up opportunities for more static sharing, situations would be helpful.
And I'll add, this is where the FCC comes in terms of creating the incentives and that policy statement that we referenced earlier. Because if we continue on our traditional approach, which is everybody who's already in gets protected, and you have to squeeze yourself in somehow, that does not create nearly as much incentive for overall spectrum efficiency as saying, look, we're going to assume when we consider about interference, we're going to assume receivers of a particular technical capability to screen out unwanted signal, and you can either invest in developing those or you can sell stuff that's going to have a lot more interference on it.
Yeah, when I think about R&D, I quickly jotted down 3 buckets that immediately came to mind. The first is commercial R&D. That's something the government doesn't need to do anything about. We see high levels of investment in R&D in private ecosystem today. Then we see what we might think of like as government operational research. So research that would be necessary to affect a change in policy, such as more resilient receivers, such as a more dynamic spectrum sharing system. And then the third bucket would be sort of what you would think about as like academic long-term research that might come out of the government, like how to use terahertz level frequency, right? And so I think we have to be very sensitive when we're talking about R&D, like what bucket does it fall into? Is this in like sort of the relative competency of the U.S. government to be running versus private networks? I think the answer will depend on just whatever use case or piece of the service area you're looking at. But I think it's important to sort of disaggregate R&D because I think it's a little bit more nuanced than just a one-size-fits-all bucket.
Part of the problem, though, is that you're not going to see huge investment from private companies in anything that requires changes in the technology, in the rules. People don't make equipment for things that are not legal to use, and we have seen too often folks who come with innovative technologies, wait and wait and wait for changes to the rules until they go out of business. So I do think that there is a role of government here to take a leadership, or at least to help private companies cover the risk of their investment by saying, yeah, that's novel, that's interesting, we'll support it. And that way you're not taking all the risk that you're going to be 5 years or more at the FCC and not get approval.
If I could just add something very quickly, I think it's amazing we've gone 50 minutes and the words artificial intelligence have not come up yet.
Why'd you have to go and ruin it, Blair?
Sorry, David.
I was thinking about it, though.
Yeah, but I think on a broad scale, in the same way that, back in the 90s, it was really about these single purpose analog networks that were protected on video and in voice, and then everything got digitized, and so that broadband became the fundamental communications network as opposed to the old voice networks. AI is going to have profound impacts on the networks. I have no idea what it is, but this is the kind of thing where I would hope that people would be saying, what does artificial intelligence tell us we're perfectly fine with what we got because everything will become more efficient? Or does artificial intelligence mean that the demands for bandwidth are going to be so much greater, right? I don't know anybody in the government who's asking that question. I think other people are addressing that question, but it would be nice to see the government try to get some points of view on that reflect what I think of as the common good as opposed to a commercial benefit.
It's an interesting book into your earlier comments, Blair, which is what happens if you don't have the capacities in the networks to drive that. In the case of AI, you may actually have real problems because it is going to put unique demands. Particularly, Joe Madden and others have been doing some work on this, looking at the licensed networks, where we don't know what it's going to mean for upload. And because it's going to demand a lot of traffic going back up into the network when traditionally we've been a download heavy industry. And I think I know our network folks are giving a lot of thought to what it means for demand, which is also feeding into their, pressure on us and desire for knowledge about what the inputs to the networks are going to be from a spectrum perspective.
Yeah. And my earlier comment about Wall Street should not reflect that that's the right policy. Wall Street is not the best at determining what policies are best for America. They are pretty good at some other things in terms of allocating capital, but here's a perfect example. I think all of us would agree that we want America to lead in AI. Well, that's both a supply side and a demand side thing. And if we have a lot of great data centers and we have the NVIDIA and the big companies and OpenAI that are doing AI, but our consumers can't really use it because our networks aren't adequate, that's not a pretty picture from my perspective. I don't think that's what happens, but I don't see anyone asking the right questions to assure that it doesn't happen. I would just say one of the things I'm most proud of the 2010 National Broadband Plan are the potholes that we filled before anyone noticed there were potholes in the road. I don't see us doing that kind of work with AI and networks.
Blair, I'm glad you brought it up, and we've been talking about it a lot in my clients and the way we look at it as well, because something on the order of 85 to 90% of all data traffic in the world right now goes over Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum. We expect that on AI, that's going to grow as well. Just as it will grow across all networks, it will grow across unlicensed networks. And since we're already carrying the vast majority of the traffic, we expect we'll continue carrying the vast majority of the traffic. So from a spectrum writ large perspective, I think everyone is looking at it saying this is probably going to increase demand on our resources, regardless of which type they're using.
That's right. I mean, I would chime back in on the license side just quickly, though, because oftentimes your Wi-Fi is connected to a much larger pipe. I mean, your Wi-Fi is carrying the last 20 feet, 30 feet of traffic back to a large pipe to get back into the network. When you're out mobile and you're relying on mobile connections outside your home and which is, becoming a higher and higher use of it, of your daily connection, and certainly to the extent you're feeding into AI systems, that's the data that's going to be most interesting. Where are people going? What are they using? What are they accessing on a daily basis? What are traffic patterns and things like that? Like, that's really going to ride on the mobile networks. That's not coming off of Wi-Fi.
Great. And we have one last question from the audience, satellite. So that's even more mobile, I guess. We don't have someone from satellite here, but do you all see the satellite industry just really adding another dimension to networks, or is it complementary to you all?
I think the answer is probably yes to that. I mean, I think none of us are satellite people per se, but I think we're seeing satellite is changing the way it operates, and as a result, it's changing the way consumers interact with satellite, right? Whether it's the direct-to-device work that the wireless carriers are doing in order to expand network coverage, it's what Starlink and Kuiper are doing to bring more ubiquitous broadband through, these large constellations of networks, of satellites to provide broadband everywhere potentially. And it's what we're seeing in terms of people just embracing this in their handset, right? I mean, Apple comes out with the ability to use a satellite connection intuitively on a handset, and it's become more mainstream than it ever was, even though satellite technology is not new. So I think what we're seeing is the technology is catching up to what consumer expectations always were. And we're at a very interesting inflection point for satellite to be a bigger part of broadband connectivity portfolio going forward.
Go ahead, Harold.
Sorry. I think that first we do have to be cognizant about the limits of satellite, both as they exist now and going forward. I've been hearing satellite is the solution to rural broadband for 25 years, but it's not, in part because terrestrial keeps, changing the game and getting more powerful. So, but also because, look, there are places that satellite will not reach. They also happen to be places that are hard to serve through any terrestrial technology. But, we got to acknowledge, if you're trying to bring connectivity to Appalachia, if you're trying to bring connectivity into the Rockies, that you are going to need to pull a line through that to get there, because between valleys and foliage coverage, you're just not going to get the same kind of reliability. We're seeing already capacity issues on Starlink, which, again, there are probably going to be ways to resolve that, from putting more satellites up to improving the technology. But this is going to be a constant problem the more we try to use it. I believe satellite is going to change things, but I see it as much more a sort of amalgamation of niche cases like Winnebagos and other mobile eSIM types, disaster relief, supplementary services like what we're talking about with Timo and Starlink and some of the others, which is important, and it's a good business, but it's not going to be a replacement for terrestrial wireless or fiber, particularly in rural areas.
Harold, I love you. I never get to be the ray of sunshine. Never do I get to be the ray of sunshine on the panels.
Yeah, Chairman Carr gave a speech yesterday at the SNA leadership dinner where he was talking about his three priorities for satellite. It's obviously something that we're focusing on quite a bit. Those three pillars were speed, simplicity, and spectrum, right? Speed, we need to get our authorizations done faster. Simplicity, the rules of the road need to be clear on an ex ante basis, not decided sort of through ex post adjudications. And then finally, spectrum. We need to be thinking holistically about our spectrum policy. I mentioned this at the beginning, but when we're looking at bands, we have to think about the technical propagation characteristics and what makes sense for what. And then we have to think about sharing along those lines. Satellite regime is built on sharing, but that regime of sharing in turn depends on sort of technical realities and the state of the art. And we need to sort of keep pace with our rules as technology advances to new ages and sort of rethink about what the art of the possible is.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up here. Well, we'll continue to listen to Chairman Carr's leadership in spectrum issues and keep an eye out on OSTP, NTIA, State Department, and of course, Congress. So thank you all for your time today, and I hope you all have a good week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.